In one of your books you've written, you really stress this idea of preaching the gospel to yourself,
Yeah.
or reminding you of the truths you've forgot, the great truths you've forgotten.
Yeah.
What does that look like in the life of a Christian?
Oh, that's a great question. I think preaching the gospel to yourself is just a framework, a mental framework, where you're constantly relating life back to the gospel, the basics of the Christian faith. At home, we always say that when Christianity becomes really effective, we go really deep on the basics. So we don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out the millennium, for example, which isn't that clear. But we spend a lot of time on the basics of the Christian faith, the Trinity, the penal substitution, the resurrection, those kind of basic things. The second coming, things that are really clear in Scripture. And so preaching the gospel to yourself is just focusing on those dimensions. So we get all of our ethics from the gospel. If you knew nothing but the cross of Christ and you really understood it, you wouldn't need to know anything else really about how you should behave towards people, because it's all there. If you really understand the cross of Christ, you don't need to know too much more about the attributes of God, because they're all displayed in the cross. So the cross of Christ and the resurrection from the dead, you go deep there. Everything's there that you need to know. And in terms of your daily practical life, when you're feeling like you failed, when you're feeling condemnation, when you're feeling inadequacy, all these things that we all feel on a regular basis, our thoughts should immediately go to the gospel and how God has expressed His love for us there, how Jesus died on the cross because we can't perform. That's the whole point, is that we can't measure up, and we should not expect to be able to measure up to our own standards, let alone to God's standards. And so going back to the gospel is constantly reminding ourselves of these truths, that God has loved us, God has forgiven us. The cross of Christ shows us man's utter bankruptcy. We are bankrupt. Our situation is so serious in God's sight that nothing could solve our problem but the death of His Son through being tortured to death on a cross in our place. So the gospel, and when I use the word the gospel, I'm talking about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but we're focusing on His death primarily because it's instructive to us, is the framework to which we constantly go back, and we're constantly preaching that to ourselves, reminding ourselves of those truths.